Hello, it's Alex. Welcome back to my channel. This week is going to be a little bit different because the video is including a tutorial, and that's because I have made this blouse, which is the candle blouse. It's from French pattern company. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's Mimoi or Mimoi. I don't know. It'll be in the title. And the pattern is only available with French instructions. I don't speak a word of French. I'm half German, so when I was at school, I was pretty much forced to learn German. So I literally do not know a word of French at all. And if you followed me for a while, you might remember that back in March, I made a dress, the Wishing Girl dress from the same pattern company, again, French instructions only. So when I saw this appear on my Instagram feed, and I absolutely adored it, I thought, I'll give it a go again. So if you like it too, then you can have a look at the tutorial and maybe you might want to make it as well. I was drawn to the simplicity of it. I like a pattern that's classic but with a bit of a twist or something a little bit more unusual about it. And in the case of this, it's obviously these pleats at the front. It's got a round neck and then the pleat folds over at the front, and it just is fastened at the back. There's a keyhole fastening at the back with a centre back seam. It was one of those patterns or one of those blouses that could be worn an awful lot, would be really useful to have in my wardrobe. If I was still going out to work out of the house, it would be a great one for work. But I also thought, you know, for those days when you want to go out and you want to wear something just a little bit nicer than a boring old top, this could be a really good one. It also gave me an excuse to buy this fabric. This is one of the Swatch Club fabrics from Lulou Designs, and when I got a swatch of this exact colour in one of my boxes, it might even have been the original startup box. This is called, I think it's called Grace. It's a Crepe de Chine, and this is the ochre colour. And when I got that sample, I loved it, and I've been kind of looking out for something that I could make. Yeah, I was looking for an excuse. For full transparency, my Swatch Club membership was gifted to me, but I did buy this fabric, and if you are a Swatch Club member, you get a discount on any of those Swatch Club fabrics, which is 10%, I think. Having been through this process before with the Wishing Girl dress earlier on in the year, I knew that the approach of using Google Translate has its limitations, and it really does. There are definitely some interesting interpretations of words, and I guess because of the slightly technical nature of a set of pattern instructions or sewing specific terms, some of it I was, really couldn't fathom at all. Obviously you've got diagrams, and the diagrams are very good, but with the language barrier there was definitely a bit of kind of fiddling around. Obviously I did the right thing and I made a toile because I wanted to save this fabric for the kind of real version. So the toile I made in Viscose fabric from Material Girl Laura, and whilst I like this fabric, I kind of haven't been using it, mostly because I've been keen to stick to autumnal colours, and obviously navy isn't one of those. So I thought it would make a good wearable toile, and it was really good to do that because trying to work out the pleats was a little bit tricky, to say the least. It was also good because I made the mistake of choosing a size according to my waist measurement, and it's actually substantially too big. So this is a size 46, which is right for my waist, and this one is a size 42, so it's 2 sizes down, which is about right for bust and hips. So if, like me, you are thicker at the waist, it's nice and loose. I mean, this is not tight fitting at all, is it? I am going to show you this a little bit closer up on the mannequin so you can see the details both on the right side and the wrong side. I went for the PDF print at home option, but I'm going to assume you all know how to do that. I'm also going to assume that you know the basics, like how to insert a sleeve. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that kind of thing, but my main focus is going to be the pleats at the back and also pleats at the front even. And now that I've worked out how to do those pleats, it's actually not that difficult. It's mostly about matching up notches. To start with, I thought it would be useful to have a slightly closer look at the blouse. It's got the round neckline here with these pleats. So the round neckline continues behind the pleats up to the shoulder seam on both sides. That's not attached down. I guess when I'm wearing it, if I find that these are flapping around, I could always do a couple of stitches hidden on the inside. It has standard set-in sleeves with a turned up hem, which looks like that on the outside or that on the inside. So there's nothing too scary on the sleeves. And then on the back, it's a keyhole opening with a rouleau loop and a single button, obviously for opening up so you can get it on and off. A centre back seam which could do with pressing a little bit better. I'm going to show you the inside. Here's the back again from the inside. So as you can see, we've got a facing here, which keeps this all looking nice and tidy. We've got some understitching here on the facing, and it's all been finished on the overlocker. You could, of course, make this a lot neater by doing some bias binding. And if you don't have an overlocker, you could just use a zigzag. The front neckline, as you can see, has a facing, which is also understitched. And the pleats are all hidden and sandwiched nicely under here, where the facing from the front meets the facing at the back. So we'll have a look at that when we go to construct it. The hem is the same as on the cuff. It's a 1 centimetre hem. I've top stitched mine. You could, if you wanted to, of course, do an invisible stitch. I will show you how the pattern instructions tell you to do that, because that's nice and neat as well. Okay, let's get on with it. I've cut all my pattern pieces out. These are the two bodice pieces. This is the back and this is the front. Because I've not got English on here, I might write on here just to remind me. I've also got my sleeve piece, my back facing piece, my front facing piece, which I also need to cut a piece of matching interfacing for, and then this small piece which is interfacing only. I'm going to have a look on the diagram for the relevant fabric lay plan and cut my pattern pieces. My pattern pieces are all cut out, including the interfacing for the front facing piece and these two little pieces of interfacing, showing you why you should always keep little scraps. I'm going to apply this interfacing, fusible interfacing, onto the wrong side of the front facing piece of fabric in our fashion fabric, and then these two little pieces here are going to go on the neckline of the wrong side of the back facing pieces. So I'm just going to go and apply that now. Now, one thing I'm going to do, because this fabric looks very similar when it's on the wrong side and on the right side, I'm just going to mark the wrong sides with some chalk. That's going to help me as I go. Actually, I don't need to do that with these really because they're interfaced, but I'm going to do it with all my other pattern pieces. Because I've not used this fabric before, I've just tested a little scrap of interfacing, fusible interfacing, just to see how it behaves, because it's not my favourite thing. It's absolutely fine. Also, because I was using black, I just wanted to see whether it showed through on the right side, and it seems okay. I really like to use these Pilot Frixion erasable pens for pattern marking, because it goes on like a biro, but then when you iron it, it just magically disappears. Although you do have to be careful with darker fabrics, but I've done a test on this and it's fine. These are nice because you get a nice sharp fine line. I've got one of these seam gauges and I've used that to put the little notch at 1 centimetre, lined that up here, and just put the marking in there, and then same on this edge here. I'm going to do the same for the other bodice, back bodice piece on exactly the same spot, but on these two pieces here, which are the facing pieces, this Frixion pen's not going to work because I've actually got to mark it where the black interfacing is. So I'm going to use chalk, which isn't my favourite just because the line is a bit thicker. So it looks like that. going to cut that out and then go over to the sewing machine. Basically, we're going to use this to make the rouleau loop. You could, of course, use ribbon or cording. There is the method in the instructions for how to use threads within the sewing machine. I'm sure if you have a look on YouTube, someone else will have done that, but for this, I'm going to do the rouleau strap. Here's my fabric that I cut on the bias. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin it right sides together, and I'm going to sew along the length and then down across at one end. All you can do with this is get as close to the outer edge and make the seam allowance as small as you possibly can, but it can be fiddly with a little scrap of fabric like this, so you just do your best. It doesn't really matter if it's not your most accurate sewing in the world. I don't get too stressed about it. I quite like doing it like this with the needle across at the end because it gives me something to hold on to. So I'm not going to start right at the end because it'll just get all chewed up. So I'm going to, as I say, sew along down and then across. It'll be something like this. Probably want a relatively small stitch length. So I've just changed it to be 2 centimetres rather than the standard 2.5 that my machine is set to. So just across, there's only a couple of stitches. I'm going to go back just to secure that. So it's not a thing of beauty, but it doesn't really matter. So I've just trimmed the excess fabric off the end. This is where I just stitched across, and now I've got this kind of tube, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, which is the inside pokey part of a Prym loop turner. I really like these loop turners. I'll put a link in the description box below. You could use anything sharp and pointy that you might have at home, and I'm basically going to use that to poke this. So this at the moment is wrong side out, and I'm literally just going to shove this up, fiddling about. See, I'm sort of doing that, but eventually with a little bit of, there we go, it's going to push up, come out the other side. So these are my 2 back facing pieces. They're right side out, and we know that because the interfacing is on the wrong side with those markings on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using this piece here, the one that goes that way. So I'm just going to put that onto one side. This scrappy old potential loop here, I'm probably going to give it a little press, and ultimately what I'm looking to do with it is to turn it into a loop. It's going to be something like that, and I'm going to want to attach it into the seam allowance in this top corner, but I need to make sure that it's below the marking that's on this side, this marking here. So I need to make sure that it's in effect tucked into that little corner. I also need to make sure that it's going to be the right size for my button. This is an Atelier Brunette button that I ordered when I ordered the fabric from Lulou Designs. So obviously if it was as big as that, there's no way that that's going to stay shut and stay secure, but it doesn't need to be too tight because obviously it's not going to fit in. So I'm going to have a little fiddle around with that, little press, and pin that in so it looks like this, and I'm going to sew it inside the seam allowance, so not quite as far across as 1 centimetre, more like sort of 8 millimetres. And just checking on the wrong side, I need to make sure that on the right side my loop is below this line here and inside of this line here, because these are the seam allowances. And you want it to be slightly below that, because when you come to sew that seam later on, you don't want to catch it in it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it to my machine, and I'm just going to go back and forth a couple of times inside here, so anywhere really in between the edge and 1 centimetre. Here it is, it's been sewn, the loop's been sewn on the right side with the stitching inside the seam allowance, which if you look at the wrong side you can see is inside that seam allowance there and not encroaching on that part there. So next up what I need to do is finish this part here of the fabric on both this facing and its friend, its mirror image friend. I'm going to do it on the overlocker, but I do need at this point to make sure there's a little notch down here. So hopefully you can see that. Once I've overlocked it, I'm not going to be able to spot that, so I need to make sure that I've marked that. So that's going to disappear when I press it. So I've marked both of the back facing pieces, and then, as I said, I'm going to overlock this edge here. Now that's done, I'm going to put these two pieces right sides together. I'm going to line up the notch where I've marked it and put a pin in there, line up the bottom edge, and I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam allowance just from the bottom up to the notch. Make sure to back tack. Then I'm going to snip a little bit where our notch is and press that seam allowance that I've just sewn open. So there it is, seam allowance has been pressed open, and now I need to overlock or zigzag this outer edge all the way around here. Also going to overlock this edge of the two back bodice pieces. This is the centre back edge, so I need to make sure that this notch here has been marked before I overlock it, because a snip is going to disappear. Now this centre back seam on both bodice pieces has been overlocked, I'm going to match the two pieces right sides together and put a pin in where that notch is, and sew 1 centimetre seam all the way down to the hem, snip it and press it open in exactly the same way as we did with the two facing pieces. This stage is done, so that's where my pin was, where the notch is. This is not sewn. Put a little snip in here and then pressed the seam open all the way down to the hem. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my facing piece, I'm going to take this back bodice piece and turn it so that the right side is facing up, and I'm going to place the facing piece with the right side facing down. So basically two right sides together, and I'm going to match up the seams. So the neckline seams are going to match at the top. To pin along that centre back edge, my loop is hiding on the inside there. When I get to the bottom part here, I'm going to put in, you see where this stitching starts on the facing, I'm going to put a pin there, but rather than having my pin facing out, it's a bit easier on this occasion to have the pin facing in. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing going up the other side. What we're going to do is we're going to start from 1 centimetre down from the top edge, so you might want to mark that. We're going to do a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way along here until we get to the stitching. So you could sort of feather in towards the stitching, feather. Once you get to the centre, you can feather out to 1 centimetre and then back up to the top. There's a really good diagram on the instructions that will show you exactly what I mean. So I started at the top. I'm about 1.5 centimetres away from where I'm going to stop, just short of this stitching here. So I'm just I've just twisted this round a little bit to get it in line. So I'm going to aim that stitching and then turn around and come back up the other side. So I've kind of moved this over all to one side. Okay, so I've twizzled it round, moved this facing out of the way, removed the pin at the bottom, just made sure that nothing's crumpled underneath, and I'm going to head off again, but gradually moving so that I am now at the 1 centimetre seam allowance. And remembering to stop 1 centimetre from the top. This is how it looks on the facing side. I did do a couple of passes of stitches here because this is where my loop is, just to make sure that that's secure. So the stitching goes down to here. That's where that notch was, and then back up the other side. This is the back of the bodice on the wrong side. You can see this side I've not pressed yet, but I have pressed this side. So what we're going to do is some understitching. So just, if I move that out of the way and fold that out, so now we're looking at the wrong side of the facing. That's the facing, wrong side of the facing folded outwards, wrong side of the bodice. This seam has been pressed towards the facing, and now I'm going to understitch it, and that just keeps things nice and neat. So I'm just going to do a row of stitching some point on this seam allowance. So I need to be between this row of stitching here, hopefully you can see that, and the edge of the seam. So about maybe 5 centimetres away from it, as far down as I can without it getting too tricky. So even if I stopped about here, that would be absolutely fine. It'll just keep it nice and neat. So this is the side that's been understitched, and this is the side that I haven't done yet. And you can see, okay, it's not been pressed, but you can see it wants to kind of, it's just not sitting flat, and you're in danger when you've got the right side facing. You see, you can't see that stitching at all on the right side. But you're in danger when you're wearing it, if you don't understitch it, of the facing starting to want to sort of migrate out and just looking all a bit messy. So I'm going to repeat the same thing on this side. I've just pressed this towards the facing, and this is just a little reminder, this is the side with the rouleau loop. So I want to make sure that that's not going to get caught up in my stitching here. So that's definitely towards the bodice, and it's going to look lovely and neat. Might just iron out where that little indentation is. Now that I've done the understitching on both sides, this is how it's looking on the wrong side. Obviously it needs another bit of a press, just to keep this facing from trying to make a bid for freedom, and just to keep it nice and neat. You could secure it somewhere around the bottom here to the seam allowance. You don't want to sew all the way through to the front, to the outside. You could do that by machine, or you could just do it by hand. So yeah, you literally just want it to be onto the seam allowance there. Moving on to the front of the bodice now. So this is my bodice piece that's been cut on the fold, and this is definitely the right side because I have chalked on the wrong side, so I know. Here is my facing piece, which I have attached the interfacing to. And now all I'm going to do is place this piece onto this around the neckline. So right side of facing piece onto right side of bodice, and I'm just going to pin it, and I'm just going to sew a 1 centimetre seam in there. So there it is on the wrong side, and I'm just going to put a couple of snips in just to help that collar lie flat. So I'm going up to but not through the stitching. Okay. So now we're going to do the same thing we did with our back facing piece. We're going to do some understitching. I'm going to sew this seam allowance that I've just clipped and pressed onto this facing. And again, I need to stitch somewhere this side of the stitch line, not that side, it's got to be this side. Here it is on the right side, so now all I do is flip it to the inside, and I'll take it to my iron and give it a really nice press. And then this neck edge will be really nice and neat. So I've just realised that I haven't overlocked the edge of this front facing. I'm not sure that there was an instruction to do so, but if there is, I've missed it. Probably would have been sensible to do that before sewing it. I'll put a title earlier, so I'm just going to quickly do it now. Now it's time to make the pleats, and this is a little bit fiddly, but once you've worked out how to do it, there's something really quite satisfying about it. The most important thing you really need to do is to make sure that you mark all your notches. You've got this notch here, which is a shoulder notch. It goes up to a point, and then underneath the facing there's another notch there. Then on the facing itself you've got a notch, which is this one here. First thing I'm going to do is flip this out, and then what we're going to do is we're going to match this notch here and bring it over to meet its friend over here, and then I'm going to pin it. So to be pretty precise, matching those 2 notches up, pop in a pin, and then match these up to this point and pop in a pin. Okay, so that looks like that. So that's what we've just matched there. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to fold this in, move the facing away, and we're going to take this notch and match it to the same one that we've just pinned here. So we're going to match this notch here on the facing with this one here that we've pinned. So we're just sliding it across, and then we're going to pin it. So it looks like that, and you really want to make sure that this edge is nice and clean. There's nothing poking out or doing anything peculiar. Should be nice and neat. You come to this neat point at the top, and at this point you're just going to run some stitching along where you've just folded inside the seam allowance, so less than 1 centimetre from the edge. So hopefully you can begin to see that our shape is coming together. This is the wrong side, and just so that you can see how it looks, obviously we've only done one side at this point, you can begin to see our folds taking shape, but we've still got more to do. So now what we need to do is put this to one side for a moment. Now I've taken the back bodice piece that's already been put together. This is the right side up, and I'm going to match it up with the front bodice piece, so I need that to lie on it, right sides together, the front and the back. So we're only concentrating on this side at the moment, so what I'm going to do is just fold this section out of the way, and I want to flip the facing piece from the back bodice outwards so that it's like that. Move that down there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to match this trusty notch here with its friend on the back bodice. I'm going to pop a pin in, and then I'm going to match this front seam to this back seam here, and the same here, and put pins in there. The front is all pinned along here. This notch is matching its friend on the back bodice. The facing has flipped out. And now what we're going to do is we're going to bring this facing piece and fold it over, and it's going to sandwich this fold in here. So we could do with moving some of this out of the way. So once again, it's that same notch where the yellow pin is, needs to match up. So that's pinned through quite a few layers now. So that's how that seam is looking. This facing from the back is completely covering the fold. And then I just need to make sure this all works. My rouleau loop is here, so again I need to make sure that's not going to interfere with this edge. So I'm going to pin that down. Now this is all pinned together, we're going to create the shoulder seam and the back neck edge. So I'm going to sew from this end here, which is where the sleeve is going to be put in. So from here, 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way across here, across all these layers here, stopping 1 centimetre short here, where we originally drew that in. Now mine's got a bit faded, so you might want to redraw yours in. And then at that corner I'm going to pivot and then sew around this neck edge here. This is the back neck edge. And once I've done that, I'm going to trim just this edge here, this back edge, not this one, and snip a couple of times just because it's on a curve, just to make it sit nicely. And cut diagonally across on this corner here, being careful not to go too close to the stitching, but just to kind of take some of the edge of it off. And as I said, a couple of snips along this curve. But this edge here, I'm now going to take to the overlocker and I'm going to overlock that edge. And once I've done that, we can unfold it. So we'll ignore the fact that my overlocker thread decided to snap here. I'm going to rethread that. But just to show you, imagine that's all overlocked. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn this out this way. There's our little rouleau loop. Bit of a wiggle along that neckline to get that looking nice and neat. Now it's turned out, hopefully you can see that it's all coming together really nicely, and it's all beautifully enclosed on the inside as well. So there's the front and there's the back. Let me show you the wrong side. Obviously it all needs a really good press. I will press this overlocked seam towards the back, but before I do that I do need to understitch this neck edge of back facing in the same way that we did the front facing and the very centre back edge here. So I just need to flip it back where it was. But it's the same story with the understitching we've done up until now, except you're not going to be able to get as much of it done because of these awkward corners. So really you're just pressing this seam allowance to the interfaced side, because that's the facing, not the outside, and running some stitching along on this seam allowance, this side, the left side of the stitching line, up to the corner as much as you can. Probably it's going to be centimetre, centimetre and a half away from the corners, but just do your best, keep that pressed and then turn it out, give it all a press, and it will start to look really nice and neat. So when I turn it out, it's looking like this, and then I'm just going to give this corner a little poke. That's looking much neater. At this point you might want to give these pleats a press along here. Obviously it's entirely up to you how far down you want to press it, but this is how we're looking. This is the right side. So yeah, if you kind of pull that over, the neckline comes up to here. At some point I will sew my button on here. I'll just do that by hand. Okay, so that's all the fiddly stuff, most of the fiddly stuff done now. The rest of it is just putting it together in the same way you put almost any top that you might make. It's just a case now of sewing the two side seams, right sides together with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then the instructions say to overlock them together and press them towards the back. So I'm going to do that. The next step is to construct the sleeves. So I've sewn them right sides together with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then following the instructions overlocked that seam allowance together and pressed it towards the back. And you can tell which is the back because your notches on here, the one where there's 2 notches, is the back seam. So next I'm going to insert the seam into my bodice. Everyone's got their own preferences for how to do this. Really all you need to do is match the bottom seam, the notches, and then ease the sleeve head in. I like to do it with pins. Some people like to do it with a row of stitching with a big stitch and then pull it to get some ease. So it's entirely a kind of personal preference thing. The other thing that the instructions suggest you do is to press the sleeve hem before constructing it, before sewing the seam together. Not sewing it down but pressing it so you've got it there for when you come to hem later. I haven't done that because I like to be able to try it on first and check that I'm happy with the length of the sleeve before I do any messing around with the hem. So I'm just going to insert these. Again, I'll sew it with a 1 centimetre seam allowance and overlock the seam. Now the sleeves are done, all that's left is the hemming on the sleeves and on the main bodice, and obviously we've all got our own preferred methods, but for the sake of following this pattern, the suggestion is that you draw one line in 2 centimetres up from the bottom and then another one a further 1 centimetre up. What you do is you fold up the bottom edge here to meet this 2 centimetre line and press it, and then once that's done you fold it a second time so that this edge here, this fold here, meets this 1 centimetre chalk line. Give it another press and then top stitch it down. So that's all that's left to do, and then we'll have a completed blouse. I really hope that you find this useful. I just felt that I'd spent time faffing around trying to work out how it came together, and it might be helpful to other people that might be interested in making it to see how it's done. I have been in touch with the sewing pattern company, so they know that I'm doing this. They're very happy, obviously, for me to do that. If you decide to make one, please let me know. In the meantime, I've still got lots to share with you, so I'll be back very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.